In my excitement to present my first workshop to everyone, I realized shortly into the presentation that I forgot to hit record. So I am adding this intro section just to put that additional information back into my presentation when I send out the video. So I just wanted to briefly introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. My name is Becky Lindstrom. I got my coaching certification from UC Davis about 6 years ago. And after I graduated, I started my practice, Ever Present Life. And I worked primarily with one-on-one clients for 5 years. And I also taught small group classes in person. And about a year ago, I began working as a consultant at St. Mary's College, where I was asked to come on board to help develop initiatives that would give first year students a better opportunity to manage their stress and anxiety. I myself have anxiety. I've been living with it now for about 11 years, and it was a real struggle early on, but I eventually figured out a lot of things that I needed to better understand about myself, which is what put me on the path to becoming a life coach and to doing what I do today. So if you have any questions about any of that or want to find out more information, you can always visit my website, or I also would encourage you to go to Instagram and follow me. I would love to follow you back. I always love to see the world through other people's eyes. When I started working at St. Mary's, it was about 9 months into that contract that I came across this quote. It was suggested to me by the vice president for mission at the college when she knew about the types of things that I was starting to develop. And I've just been so grateful that I'm in a place where this is understood, that the idea that, you know, emotional resilience can be hard to define, but I think this best explains it right here. We will not promise you happiness. We will not wish you security, for we know that you can be secure only when you can stand everything that can happen to you. I think that's really a great definition of emotional resilience. And this comes from Sister Madaleva Wolf, who was the third president of St. Mary's College. And as you can see from the dates, she became the president in the middle of the Great Depression. She was president all through the Second World War, and she retired in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement. And she was born in 1887, which means she was also a young adult when the 1918 flu pandemic, World War I, and the start of the Great Depression were all happening. So she was, you know, when she says something like this, it really makes me consider it, because she obviously understands that a lot of things can happen to us in life that we don't have planned, and we have to be able to figure out a way forward through all of that. And it may not always be a happy life, but it can absolutely be an emotionally resilient life and a fulfilling life. And I developed the Wholeness Framework in my work at St. Mary's to help students and everyone really understand what it means to be a whole human being. And so this idea of cultivating emotional resilience can have many definitions. I just want to be very clear on what my definition is so that you understand. I'm talking about self-awareness, internal self-worth, and fulfillment. And so this is the end of the portion that I forgot to record in the presentation. So you will be picking back up now with the presentation as it was given on November 1st. Today, we are going to be, like I said, focusing on this idea of emotional resilience. And so today especially, we're going to be looking at self-awareness and internal self-worth. And so there are a lot of different ways to define emotional resilience. It's kind of one of those phrases that nobody really has a definitive meaning of. So I want to make sure you're very clear on what I mean by emotional resilience. I mean that you have the self-awareness to be able to understand when you are dealing with stress and anxiety and fear, that you also have the self-awareness to know who you are at your core, and that when you have that awareness, that you also recognize that you have internal self-worth as opposed to external self-worth. And these are the things we're going to be talking about in a lot more detail today. And the activity that we are going to do, that I will be teaching you, is going to directly tie to building internal self-worth. And so when you have self-awareness and internal self-worth, then it's a lot easier to find fulfillment, although there are still some things that need to happen in order to really better understand what fulfills you personally. And so next week, we are going to be really getting into this idea of fulfillment. But today we're going to be focusing on the first two aspects of emotional resilience. And so self-awareness, I want to offer up this way of looking at the world. So I developed this model to better explain to people kind of what's going on in here. Because there's a lot going on in our brains. There's a lot going on in our minds. There's a lot going on in the world too. And it's hard at times to know, when we talk about your perspective being so important, what shapes your perspective? And how do you allow that perspective to ripple up and impact the way you think and the way you feel, and then the way that influences your circumstances and your actions? Like, all of these things are tied together, but it's just not easy in the moment to understand how. And so this model hopefully will be able to make that easier to understand, and I will be referring to it periodically. And so really what it is that I want people to come away with, because there's a lot going on here, but the main thing is that in our lives, the vast majority of us, most of the time, are dealing with these two outer layers. We are either focused on the circumstances and what our actions are based on those circumstances, or we are focused on our thoughts and our feelings about what's happening in the external world. These are the two primary layers that we function in. And when we are in a coaching space, a life coaching space, or just a space of deeper personal reflection, we're going to be here. So even though there are so many things going on in the world, and that's why I'm doing this, we won't be talking about the specific things that are going on in the world. You may talk about it together as you're working through things, but I will be focusing on these two deeper layers here, both the perspective layer, which is shaped by our beliefs, our motivations, and our intentions. And then really today, where we are going to be going is this core level, which is at the core of who you are, these traits and these natural tendencies that you have, and then your core values. And we're not going to talk too much about that today. We're going to be focusing on core values more next month. But I really want to get into this core today and talk about these traits and tendencies, because this has a very strong influence on how we perceive things in the world and how we respond to them. But if we aren't aware, self-awareness being the key here, if we aren't aware of what's going on in our core about those traits and tendencies, it can be really challenging. And so one of the biggest things as far as those traits and tendencies goes, and by that I mean traits are typically fixed. And I'm not going to get into details on the research behind all of that, but personality traits we tend to think of as being fixed, whereas tendencies change over time, but they don't change really quickly. They usually change slowly. So in any given moment, there are certain things that feel more natural to you and things that don't. Maybe you identify as an introvert or an extrovert, and to try to be the other doesn't feel natural to you. That's what I mean by a natural tendency. So I want to talk about 4 important tendencies, maybe traits, depending on whether you see them as fixed or sort of things that shift over time. But these 4 traits are so important because they describe me, I'll be honest. They also directly influence my experience of anxiety during times of adversity. And so I want to be very transparent with people today. First of all, are you a selfless perfectionist? And by selfless perfectionist, I mean these 4 things. Are you empathetic? So do you easily pick up on the emotions of the people around you? Are you naturally selfless? So is it a lot easier to put the needs of everyone else in your life ahead of your own? And when you do put your own needs first, do you sometimes tend to feel a little bit guilty about it, or maybe a lot guilty about it? And that's something you maybe recognize and have worked on over time, but you know that sort of your default tendency is to feel that sense of guilt when you do it. Do you see yourself as a perfectionist? Which means, do you hold yourself to high expectations in pretty much every area of your life? And lastly, when you don't meet those high expectations, do you judge yourself quite harshly? And so I'm curious if, for those of you who do feel comfortable, if you could please in the chat box enter how many of those 4 traits do you identify with? It could be 1, it could be 0. It might be 4, 3, 2, whatever it is. If you could go ahead and enter the number that indicates which traits you identify with. I'm curious. Good. Okay. And it's really helpful. And some of you may be thinking, okay, I used to identify with this one, but not completely. And so, but I've worked on it, and that's good. Yeah, lessening their impact. Yeah, good. Okay. Good. And so you will continue to enter those numbers, and it's good to see there's a variety. And I think that's important to recognize, is that not everybody is going to identify with all 4. But if you do, that definitely can lead to the experience of anxiety. And it's partly because, I should back up really quick, when you pick up on the emotions of everyone around you pretty much all the time, and you're naturally selfless, so you want to help them. That's just kind of a natural instinct that you have, is to help. And you hold yourself to high expectations, and so you feel that you should be able to help really well. And then life happens, and you're not able to control all the things that you would like to be able to control, and so that makes it difficult to be able to help in the way that you want to. And then you get really hard on yourself when that happens. And the person still is maybe unhappy or feeling badly. You still want to help them. You still expect you should be able to do that well. So you just kind of go back and repeat and you know, try to help again, and repeat that cycle for a couple of decades. And you may also end up with generalized anxiety like I have. But the thing I want you to understand is that, again, perspective is really, really important. These 4 things are very challenging for me when I have a lot of fear going on in my life, and I'm taking kind of a fear-based perspective. When I am able to recognize that, become aware of that, and work on that, these 4 traits become the very best things about me. And so the experience of being able to find emotional resilience is not to shut these things down. It is to be able to shift your perspective of them and to be able to use them effectively in your life, because they can be a huge asset. Even your inner critic can be a huge asset. And so it's really important to be able to recognize that. So we will be, again, we're going to be exploring this for the next couple of months. So this isn't anything you need to, you know, completely pick up today. So I want to go ahead, and I just want to at least bring this into your awareness so that it can start to percolate today and going forward. So we are going to move on to really, I think, what is the primary focus today, which is this idea of external self-worth, or internal self-worth. Oh my gosh, I apologize. So external self-worth is something that we are all very familiar with. And in our world, we have pretty much set it up so that the vast majority of us all the time are deriving our worth from outside of ourselves. Because we are born, we come into this world, we start grade school, and we start getting grades. And then we get into high school and we have a GPA. And then we get into college, and you know, that GPA determines a lot. And at some point, you know, you graduate and you go out into the work world, and you start getting job evaluations, and you get a salary, and you drive a certain kind of car, and you vacation in certain places. You know, all of these things are considered to be external sources of self-worth. They can be based on your appearance, your accomplishments, your academics, and the approval of other people. That is what is considered external self-worth. And this is based on the research of Jennifer Crocker, who is a professor at Ohio State University. She's a social science researcher. And so we are really going to focus this idea of shifting your perspective. A huge piece of emotional resilience is shifting from external self-worth to internal self-worth. And so I want to really emphasize what that is and what that looks like, so that when we go into the activity that we're going to do here shortly, you all have a much better understanding of what I mean by self-worth and internal self-worth. So first of all, your worth is not defined by the assumptions, judgments, or expectations of the external world. So that means your worth is not defined by your GPA. It's not defined by where you graduated from school, or what job title you have, or how much money you make, or any of those things. It doesn't, your weight is not a factor in your internal self-worth. None of these things matter. Your worth is not defined by the external world. Another thing that tends to happen in just the society that we live in is we hear this phrase, I deserve this, a lot. I deserve to be happy. I deserve to be healthy. I deserve to have, you know, the partner in my life that I want. We hear this word deserve a lot. And if I could banish any word in the English language, I would get rid of that word, especially when it comes to self-worth, because deserve immediately implies that we have to earn it. I deserve to be happy. I've earned the right to be happy. And the thing that I want people to understand about self-worth is this, that your worth is not dependent on you receiving the things that you feel you deserve. There is a very big difference between deserving to be happy and knowing that you are worthy of being happy. Even if you are not happy, you can know that you are worthy of that. When you feel that you deserve it because you've somehow earned it, but the world hasn't quite gotten that figured out yet, that isn't helpful for you. And it's not, you know, it's just another form of external self-worth. Knowing your worth means even if you don't get the thing that you want or believe that you deserve, you still know you're worthy of it. And that's something no one can take away from you. And it doesn't matter if you don't receive the thing. What matters most is that you know that worth at your core. And so when you are primarily deriving your worth from the external world, again, from your appearance, the approval of other people, your accomplishments, your academics, this is where fear most of the time becomes that primary motivator. And that fear as a motivator is one of the most challenging ways to deal with adversity. When adversity happens and you are disconnected from your internal self-worth and you are getting your worth from the world, and then fear is involved, it is a recipe for stress and anxiety. And so when you are connected to your internal sense of self-worth, your main motivator is no longer fear. Your primary motivation in life is to express your core values. And like I said, we're going to be talking a lot more about that next month, but even this month, we are going to touch on it a little bit. So when you are connected internally to your worth, fear is still there, but fear does not hijack your core values and determine the things that you do, those actions you take. Your perspective stays really grounded and rooted in your core values. And that means your inner critic can't hijack your core values with the fear. And so what you end up doing is, even in the midst of adversity, you end up living a life that is really, you know, grounded and rooted in what you value and expressing those values. And that can give you a sense of fulfillment even when the worst things in the world may be happening. And so what we are going to be starting to get into today is this idea that the things that separate us from our internal self-worth are beliefs, right? Nobody is holding us back from our internal self-worth. We're not, restricted in any way physically from being able to access it. We're mentally restricted from being able to access it by the beliefs that we hold. And so we are going to start to explore those beliefs, but we have to do this in a way that is very practical, because we can't live, when I talked about that core clarity model, we live in the external world. We have lots of thoughts and feelings about that. We can't live our life at our core all the time. I think, if you were maybe cloistered away somewhere in a monastery as a Buddhist monk or, something like that, you might be able to really live at that core level. But the rest of us are all out in the world, and we have to engage with the world and deal with it there. And so we have to figure out practical ways to be able to connect to our internal self-worth and to notice those beliefs that are holding us back from it, without having to shut everything down and just go into that personal private space and be able to figure them out. We need practical ways to do this. And so that's what we are going to do today. We are going to learn a practice that I kind of created to help my clients when I noticed, there's this disconnect happening. They don't see themselves clearly. They don't understand, like, they are the amazing person they're trying to be. I already see that in them, and they don't see it. So I needed to figure out, how could I get them to see who they really are? And so that's what we are going to be practicing today. And the way that this came about, that I came up with this exercise, was personally me dealing with all my own stuff, trying to see myself more clearly. I came across this quote from Carl Jung, who is a psychologist and a philosopher. And the quote is that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a greater understanding of ourselves. And I get that. This is not something Carl Jung invented, right? You can find quotes from Marcus Aurelius 2,000 years ago. You can find a quote in the Bible that is very similar. This is an idea that's been around for a very long time. And it is this idea that we tend to project onto other people the things that we ourselves are also doing, or things inside of us that, we're frustrated with, but we see it readily in other people, but we don't see it in ourselves. So this idea that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves is great to be able to understand, but it is also fantastic sort of fuel for our inner critic. Because the last thing that a selfless perfectionist needs is a better way to be able to find their flaws. Because we are really good at honing in on those, and that inner critic is just like, oh great, now you have a way to figure out all the things that are wrong about you, and then you can now focus on fixing them. And that did not help me back, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, when I was struggling to try to deal with raging anxiety. And so I have this very analytical mind that likes to find the consistencies in things and thinking, okay, well, if this is true, then this also has to be true. Everything that we love, respect, or admire in others can lead us to a greater understanding of ourselves. If the things that irritate me lead me to a greater understanding, then the things I love about others should also lead me to a greater understanding, right? That's the consistency there, logically. And then all of a sudden I thought, oh my gosh, if that's true, what does that mean? Like, I used to spend my entire life being around people that I loved and respected and admired, and I hoped that somehow by like osmosis, I would pick up all those amazing things and I would somehow become that. Or if I like really tried hard to be like them, that I might eventually be that amazing. I used to, really think that. And then when they weren't around me, I thought that those amazing qualities were not present in my life. They were only there if the person was present. And so when I did this switch, all of a sudden my brain just, like, oh my gosh, what if I am as amazing as those people? Oh no, my inner critic was just really not thrilled about that idea. And so I had to do my own internal work to be able to come to this understanding that everything I loved and admired about other people was also in me. And I had to find a way then to help my clients be able to make that same connection. And that's when I created this activity that we are going to do today. And so I don't want to go into too much more detail about that because I want you to sort of understand this process as it unfolds as you go through this today. But what I do want to do before we go into breakout sessions is I want to create a safe space. So I want everybody to understand that, first of all, most of you are spread out around the country and don't know each other. So that might be part of helpful of the keeping things confidential. But even for those of you who do know each other, whatever is shared in this space, I would really like to ask that it remain confidential. And this is also a judgment-free zone. So nobody is going to be, you know, judging or assuming or expecting things of other people. That's something I would really like to ask that we all refrain from doing. I would also ask that while we are all free to share our experiences, please do that. One thing I would like to ask all of us to refrain from doing is offering advice to other people. And it can be hard to do that sometimes because it feels like helping. But what happens when we offer advice is that we actually end up cutting off connection. So it's one thing to say, oh, I read this amazing book when I was really struggling and it helped me so much. And that's all you need to say. And if you take it the next step and say, and I think you should read it, that's where the connection cuts off. So we're just going to ask that we all refrain from that advice offering instinct that we sometimes have. And the last thing that I would like to ask, because I know those of you out there who maybe do identify with all 4 traits of selfless perfectionism, it can be really hard. We want to help other people, especially if they are struggling. Please know and trust that everyone who is here today is going to get what they need. I can't tell you how, and I can't tell you when, but I can guarantee you that they will get what they need. We need to trust that about ourselves. We need to trust that about each other, because that is what allows us then to be able to, again, stay open and connected and to, you know, really be able to actually make that happen, to get what we need.